They just need to not finish in the playoffs. They can never win
What is that, to move up a league, you mean?
Yeah,
Or
so Bolton Wanderers, for those people who do not know,
the people wondering,
currently terminally reside in the third tier of English football, for some reason called the First Division.
Yeah, well, that's the good tier. All the good teams are there.
That's great. Yeah, all the best teams. Yeah, yeah. And the top 2 teams go up automatically, and then the next 4 play a series of playoff games to get the third promotion position. And Bolton Wanderers have had terrible I don't know. They just haven't. They're always in the playoffs and they never win. So it'd be just quite nice to not have to. I'm talking like I know what I'm talking about.
We should just start a sports podcast.
I've told Google to tell me every time that they're playing and what the score is, and by virtue of that makes me a supporter, right? It makes me a fan.
And you go, oh yeah, they did it again.
Yeah,
the boys. Look at them.
Oof.
Yep.
Yeah. I'll buy a jersey and then I'll be right.
Oh, get a jersey. A Bolton Wanderers.
They've got this really great third. They've got their jersey's horrible, but they've got this nice third team. Their third jersey is pink, which is quite cool. But the other one's horrible. It's obviously covered in gambling and all sorts of other sponsorships and
Bitcoin and Well, you do that. I'll get a Huddersfield Terriers jersey. We'll be the third league guys. Hey, Dodgers won the World Series. Speaking of sports,
I mean, it's become so routine now, Jack.
Here we go at the anti-Dodger bullshit. Dodgers are very close.
Sorry.
Dodgers are very close to just doing a general cartel in baseball, to just establishing a monopoly and just not letting go, which I think is quite good. I think it's quite good.
Yeah. This must be just a strange warped perception of time that I'm having, whereas baseball seems to be interminable, but then always ending at the same time.
Yeah,
it always seems to,
I'll be the first to say
always seem to be reporting that the Dodgers have won the World Series.
Yeah, they did it again. They did something insane.
Yeah, but maybe my life needs a few more landmarks than.
I feel like soccer is the same thing, where it's just it's always going. They don't really ever get a break. There's always the FA Cup, as I said, is always happening. My Terriers are always losing. What are you going to do?
Yeah. Well, I'm a fake football fan, so I don't know what to do. I don't know how to defend that.
I don't know. I think if you're wandering around with a pink Bolton Wanderers jersey, people will probably assume they're like, this guy probably knows. He probably knows the Bolton Wanderers.
Yeah.
All right. All right. Speaking of the Bolton Wanderers, Dan. Speaking of wandering our way through pretending to understand value theory, recently we were I don't know. I was going to say we decided to come back to the fundamental principle stuff. I don't think we're ever particularly very far from comparing that to certain things that we read, whether it's strategy, recently, the Isabel Guerrero, where she's kind of you shouldn't think about the critique of the Gotha program the way that the group of international communists do. Although she doesn't call them out by name, or systems theory stuff or whatever. We're never particularly far from it, but we haven't spoken about it specifically. And I think a lot of the critiques that have come up about it. So we found some critiques and we're going to talk about them. And we're going to talk about some responses to those critiques. We just found a bunch of essays basically. And I didn't realize, but Hermann Lueer, who translated the second edition into English for the first time, I think that was only published in 2020, which is insane to me. That's crazy. I remember when it was published, but I didn't realize that was the first time that the second edition was in English. That's
wow. I think there'd been some Google translations knocking around. I guess people had read it and stuff, but
first time somebody that speaks both languages, able to coherently make a translation.
Yeah, made a deliberate effort to faithfully translate as it got.
Exactly. And so what we did was we read, somebody on our Discord posted this critique of it a while ago. It might have been Viv, actually. I forget who did it. Thanks to whoever did it. But it was by this group called Angry Workers, who I've come across, I think, a few times, actually. I forgot to mention that to you before we started this, because it's actually, I have some kind of funny stories. Anyway, they're a London-based...
We'll talk about that afterwards.
We'll talk about that afterwards when the mics are off. No, just kidding. It's not that ominous. But they have written what appears to basically just be like a capital L, capital C, like leftcom critique of the fundamental principles, which I think the critiques that we've come across have mainly been like ultra left critiques, I like kind of like pulling at straws there, but like the ultra left critiques, like the Jasper Burns stuff or the kind of like EndNote stuff, Dove, that kind of thing. But I don't think I really realized how informed those people are in their critiques of like council communists in general, I think, by like Bordigists and like left comms of that kind of type. So I actually really enjoyed kind of reading this and seeing kind of where a lot of those critiques come from. Then we read Hermann responding to that in a very like curt, not like rude or anything like that, just a very short fashion, which I really appreciated. And then we read another critique by Ian Wright, kind of touching on other ideas. And yeah, it was good. I really enjoyed kind of going back into this, and I'm looking forward to kind of, specifically getting back into talking about this plan and how it works and how it doesn't. Because like I said, I think I'd always been thinking that this had been published in English for a lot longer than it had. And so I'm always kind of like, man, why don't more people talk about this? But now that I've realized that, it's like, well, that's why. It's like actually a lot of people are talking about it for it only being published like 5 years ago in English. So, yeah.
Yeah, in some ways it seems really absurd to have like that's not you and I, that's like, the left.
Yeah.
This is I guess this is not actually how this text is looked upon, but I was about to characterize it as the left's like fundamental reference stone for how you would organize communism. It's funny to have it be a text that was written in the 20s, although actually, all the left's primary reference points are actually books that were written in the 20s. So
yeah, not too different in that respect.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm no go.
Well, I mean, I was just going to say, like I said, I think that the angry workers thing is definitely coming at it from maybe like more of a Bordigist kind of like leftcom angle. And the kind of Hermann's response is very much like he's a hard, like, he's a councilist basically, right? As far as I can tell. It certainly comes across in this piece.
Yeah.
And then the Ian Wright piece, I'm not really sure, but it does raise some good points. So
yeah. I mean, I guess in some way, like, in some ways, it's nice to read the Hermann piece countering this, to have that argument put forward. In some ways, it sort of clouds my perception a little bit as well. But I guess basically his characterization of the angry workers text is basically to say that they have two criticisms, and then he endeavors to rebut those. I guess their two criticisms, as described by him, are, I suppose, for one, this is a description of like circulation under communism, and not necessarily fundamental principles of communist production and distribution. So it's a description fundamentally about distribution. I think we could probably critique that quite easily, and we can get onto that in a minute. That's not and then there are the criticisms, I guess, a bit broader, which is to sort of say, well, their primary mechanism for doing this is something which is actually not particularly well described in their book, which is the form and functioning of workers' councils, how they're going to interact, how they're going to discipline workplaces, how they're going to contribute toward economic planning. And this is the other piece that we read that was criticizing the fundamental principles, really centered on this. I think is that the real question is, how is the plan actually going to be formulated? If you're going to have communism, to some extent, the most important thing is that its production designed around a commonly agreed plan, which I think is a butchering of Marx quote, I suppose. So that's the other criticism that's opened up. And now, to some extent, actually, what's happening there in the angry workers text is they're following the argument that's laid out in Jasper Burns a little bit, where it's like the test of Marxism and the test of communism. And I hadn't really occurred to me that they were being influenced by readings of Bordiger or Bordigist theory. But given that idea in Jasper Burns about the test of communism comes from Bordigist thinking, it does make sense. But
Yeah, I think I'm just I just saw Town and Country as like the
Oh,
main
yeah.
thing.
Oh, that's your red flag for Bordiger, is it?
I know where this is coming from. I mean, yeah. Let's start with the angry workers one, because you're right to point out those two main criticisms. And I guess I should say to people, like, Dan, you said something really funny right before I started recording, where you were like, I started reading this and then was like, wait, how does capitalism work? And now I have to go back and like understand commodity fetishism. God damn it. To understand if this whole thing works. What I'll say is probably, like, I don't know, if you want to run down on how the fundamental principles stuff and the critique of the Gotha program like schemes work, well, either just go read those, or the IDA has some really good stuff. From Alpha to Omega has gone through it a lot. All that to just say we're probably not going to go through like the ins and outs of this scheme. We'll probably talk about how it works, but we probably won't just give like an outright, like explanation of the whole thing. We'll just kind of assume that's there. But yeah, I mean, to start with like the angry workers critique that it's like there's nothing in here about like political decisions. It feels like a lot of criticisms of this kind of scheme fall into two broad categories. One of them is just not trusting workers, which is like, I think, present in a surprising amount of like Marxist literature. And not just in like the economics that people write about, but also like certainly in the politics. But then also like, I don't know, I don't want to be too flippant, but like a kind of semantics about the title of that book, where it's like, how fundamental are these principles? And it's like, okay, call it something else then, you know what I mean? Like, the group of international communists called their book The Fundamental Principles of Communist Production and Distribution to make a point that the way that they think about modes of production, the social relations are put first. And that is the basic building block of everything else, how people relate to production, how they relate to each other, and how firms relate to each other. That, obviously in capitalism with the division of labor, but then also in communism with the division of labor, like perhaps at the beginning, you're going to have to kind of like think about things in this way. And, I think that maybe that last one like definitely comes up a little bit in the angry workers piece, where it's like, you can't really claim, they're saying that you can't really claim to be discussing the fundamental nature of communist society if you don't have anything in here about how like politics or just broadly like decisions are made in that society. And I think that like, it depends on, I guess, how you're defining a mode of production. I think if you wanted to do a similar thing that the group of international communists are doing to capitalism, you would probably find yourself talking pretty much just about value theory and about Marxist theory of like surplus value, production price, and you probably just kind of like leave it there. But I think obviously if you're trying to talk about capitalism, you can't just talk about those things. You need to talk about like markets, you need to talk about political structures, you need to talk about all these different things. So in that sense, like, sure, like I guess it's a fair critique, but that, and Hermann just says this in his response right away and then just kind of moves on. Like, that's never, I think, been the goal of the fundamental principles. And when they're talking about the basic building blocks of communist society, you can quibble with if you think it would work or not. But I do think like what they're describing are the fundamental building blocks of communist society. And I don't think they're really making many pretenses to be discussing much else beyond that. Again, decide for yourself if that's to its detriment or not. But I think kind of you got to criticize it on its own terms, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, like, I guess there's a reason why I find myself like having to dig into like what is capitalism and what is it that we're trying to overcome in capitalism. It's because like, and maybe in some respects there is a problem with the fundamental principles where their criticism of capitalism and what they believe needs to be overcome is almost so clinically simplistic. It's like, I guess I feel like a lot of people just react negatively because they've chosen one mechanism that needs changing. We need to, the adopting the focus on a unit of account being necessary for operating a communist economy, and choosing the labor time as that unit of account, and then having that govern both how firms operate vis-a-vis one another in the production process, and then also how workers consume based on the same basis. I mean, one of the things that really not surprised me, that I really wanted to dig into with the angry workers to some extent, is like how they seem to be actually criticizing what's necessary for a socialist revolution to do to overcome capitalism. Like, for me, or for my understanding, like the necessary thing to do is to overcome commodity fetishism, and to overcome the kind of like separation that's brought about in a capitalist economy between the kind of like full socialization of production, like the grand scale of production under capitalism, the degree to which people are so thoroughly connected with one another, how the capitalist economy has become so globalized. And the key contradiction with that being the maintenance of private ownership and control of the means of production, and private ownership of the sort of the proceeds of production, what is produced. Like, the workers don't own what is produced. All they're given is their wage, which is a sort of like a portion of the wealth that's created by the work that they do. And I don't know how explicitly it is stated in the Fundamental Principles book, but I always sort of took what they're proposing as being a sort of like a direct effort to overcome that separation between private ownership and control and social production under capitalism, and to sort of like fully socialize, sort of close that circle to fully socialize production by sort of getting rid of private property. If we sort of remember back to reading the Fundamental Principles book, obviously what they start with is a critique of the Soviet Union and how the Soviet Union endeavored to transition toward communism. And one of their critiques is to say, well, the Soviet Union nationalized the productive forces. They nationalized the sort of like, they sort of nationalized all the private property, but they didn't actually collectivize ownership of the products that the workers produce. All of that stuff was still accumulated in the hands of the state, and the workers were still just paid a wage. They weren't paid the sort of full value of what they were created. So under the terminology that I always find really confusing from the Fundamental Principles, where they talk about giving the workers the right of disposal over what they produce, the kind of like that correction to the communist program, which is the fundamental basis of their text, always sort of excited me, because it seemed to also be an effort to overcome what I'd adopted as like the primary contradiction under capitalism to some extent, and the primary contradiction under capitalism, which foreshadows a transition to sort of like a communist mode of production or a socialist mode of production. But the angry workers seem to totally overlook that as a legitimate, like, primary contradiction that needs to be overcome, and they sort of seem to sideline that effort to some extent. I mean, they sort of, coming back to this, what you were saying before about like distinction between town and country kind of thing. One of the critiques they make is they say, well, these fundamental principles, these laws that the group of international communists are trying to put in place, do not overcome a whole series of contradictions that they want to highlight. So they talk about the distinction between intellectual and manual labor. They talk about, as we say, the distinction between town and country, and sort of like, and they make the assertion that like these divisions are what's fundamental to Marx, when he's talking about what is necessary to overcome to sort of like socialize labor. So in my reading of their text, I sort of felt like they were kind of like either misunderstand. No, I don't mean to say that, like, make it sound like I have the best understanding of Marx. So I won't say that they misunderstand Marx, but they're choosing a different set of essential contradictions in capitalism than I feel like I've learnt as being important, but also a different set of contradictions as I feel like the fundamental principles are aiming to overcome as well. I don't know whether that was your reading, but
No, yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, and I think you're absolutely right to bring up commodity fetishism as this main driver. I think the thing that I took the most when we read the Isaac Rubin book on value was when he decides to kind of start the whole book talking about commodity fetishism, to the point where he's just like, you know, commodity fetishism gets this rap as being like kind of like a very humanist thing, which it is. But he was like, actually, commodity fetishism is just Marx's theory of value, basically. Like or not his theory of value. It's like his theory of capitalist society, right? So I think, you know, the way that capitalist production operates, like it necessarily is able to, like, just by virtue of operating, it's able to mask exactly what it is that it's doing, which is like separating workers from the products of their labor, exploiting workers, obviously, and then like all of the other horrible things that go along with that in this kind of rush to accumulate value. Like, I really appreciate the way that the fundamental principles are able to kind of begin from a point of talking about wage labor in this regard, much like kind of like how Rubin talks about commodity fetishism. They begin by talking about wage labor. And I think that on one hand, that's just like a really sound thing to do in terms of political agitation, because it's like right off the bat, you're telling people what your experience is, you know, your intuition that you're being exploited is correct. Here's why, here's what needs to change. And yes, actually we're fighting for something that's in your best interest, namely like work being the measure of consumption. Like, to them, that is communism, right? And it's like, wow, like that's actually really, I think, valuable propagandistic way of talking about things. But I mean, the actual like economic reason that they bring it up is because, you know, they give this outline of the way that wage labor works under capitalism, where you believe that you're getting paid for at least part of what it is that you're doing during the day in terms of like the output that you create. Like, if you're a lawyer, you're like, okay, I get paid more because my service is really valuable to society. They really value what it is that I'm doing. If I work, you know, like stacking like hay bales and I make a lot less, like that's because, well, just what I'm doing just isn't as valuable. And it's like Marx's amazing insight is that is just a fundamentally wrong way of thinking about it, because you're not getting paid for what it is that you create. You're getting paid for the value of your labor power. The reason a lawyer gets paid more is because it costs society a lot more to train up a labor, right? You can't just replace a lawyer with like some schmuck off the street, but you can replace generally, like it would be a lot easier to replace somebody stacking hay bales, right? It has nothing really to do with what they're creating necessarily. Obviously, there's like a social element of this, of what you expect those people's lives to have, whatever. But at the base of it, what you're doing is being paid to kind of like rent your labor power, basically, right? And that kind of allows them to say, well, because capitalism separates the worker from the product that they're creating, it allows this kind of cleavage where there is now this class that owns the means of production and not only owns what is created, right? You don't get paid for a part of what you create. The capitalist just owns all of it, no matter how much you worked, right? That class is then also able to own the means of production, establish control of society through that way, and have a class dictatorship that we basically just call capitalism. And so for them, because they're starting at that point in terms of what needs to be, you know, moved past to get to communism, I think wage labor and commodity fetishism really go hand in hand the way that they talk about it, because like they make the point that wage labor can only be abolished by ending this kind of like gap between, you know, your labor and what it is that you make. And again, like, I think you're absolutely right to kind of talk about how confusing this term right of disposal is, because it almost, like, when you first read that book, you're kind of like, are they just kind of talking about like an anarchist kind of like, you just keep what you make and everyone's a petty capitalist? And it's like, that's very much not what they're talking about. They're talking about a kind of like economic understanding and control kind of that you have when your labor that you do in one form, as Marx would say, is then exchanged for the exact same labor in another form, right? So like, you know, you work 8 hours, you can then go exchange it for roughly 8 hours worth of goods, right? All other things being equal. And yeah, I think that that's just like broadly like a really excellent way to agitate to people. You know, I think it's pretty intuitive for people, and I think it really ties communism into both being a like moral quest, because it's like clearly this is just wrong and evil, but then also like, hey, it's in your best interest to act in everybody's best interest, right? And the last thing I'll kind of just say is I hadn't really realized this before I read kind of Herman's bit, But I was like, you can kind of think about that in like a weird, like kind of like systems way, right? This idea of kind of like bridging that gap between your work and the kind of like total social output of society, where I was kind of thinking that, like, as you say, like when they begin by kind of criticizing the Soviet Union, and they say that there was still this kind of like administrative, like, no, you're just being paid like, this kind of like rent for your work, and we're actually going to control everything over here at the top, and we're going to kind of like technocrat our way into having like the perfectly balanced economic system, right? They're saying that like this kind of like connection between your labor and the social product actually needs to be a like emergent process, emergent kind of like, I don't know, what would you say, like an emergent property of the system itself. It can't be something that somebody sitting somewhere with a big brain is like deciding all the perfect inputs. Somebody on a computer, it can't just be that computer deciding perfect inputs. This connection needs to actually be emergent from the process of labor and production and distribution itself. And I think that's the thing that's so like excellent about what the fundamental principles are saying. It's like, all other things aside about you needing ways to organize this, and you needing ways to like, plan, right? This is like, I think, the fundamental principle of communist society. Yeah, I think it's quite cool.
It's really interesting that you end with that, because I guess one of the critiques they do make, that is made throughout this, is that like there's a real essentialism being made between the economic and the political, and the two are not sort of like unified in any particular way. And just to some extent, the critique is made that they're overlooking the political in a lot of ways. Now we can just make the sort of like Herman's rebuff to that, which is like,
bullshit.
Well, go and read Pannekoek, and then,
yeah, Google Anton Pannekoek.
Yeah. But like the more interesting thing to reflect on, and I think that's maybe, like, correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm misinterpreting what you're saying, but like the more interesting thing to reflect on is like, okay, and it's a bit of a cop out to some extent. It's the fundamental principles cop out to a small degree, is just to say, well, all that these laws are doing is supplying workers with the knowledge necessary to engage in, establish, run the dictatorship of the proletariat, and sort of like institute the running of a classless society, I suppose. But the kind of like the counter to that, I suppose, is to say, well, you're just supplying some laws of how the economy is going to operate. And I do like it. To give the angry workers piece its due, like I do like the way it lays out some of these problems, because these are legitimate questions to ask, I suppose. They're just not necessarily legitimate criticisms, perhaps, of the fundamental principles in and of itself. Questions to ask, like, how are you actually going to, like, I don't know, how are you going to overcome people's desire to, like, have a certain particular skills that they have be remunerated better than others, or like how are you going to overcome people's unwillingness to do particular types of onerous work, or how are you going to plan a growth strategy for your economy, or like all these other things. But like, is it the case of what you were just implying was like this offers some kind of feedback mechanism to allow for the sort of like political impetus in the working class to like answer some of those questions, I guess?
Yeah. I mean, I think it does quite a bit. You know what I mean? Like, I think honestly, I almost feel like the fundamental principles book, and almost to a little bit the Hermann piece, like it almost undersells what this is doing, because like, yeah, they say, making a direct connection between total social output and individual labor, like that is communism for them, right? But like, it is doing more than just giving people the understanding of like getting past commodity fetishism on the kind of like concrete individual sense, where you go to a market and you go, oh, I understand what that price means now, as opposed to now it's just like, I have no idea what that means, right? Like, like what it's like, it's making labor directly social. It's getting past like, I don't know, maybe the point that I'm trying to make is that like in the angrier workers piece, and this is like kind of a common reframe, is that like you can't just make this new legal relationship and expect society to just be like perfect, right? Now, I don't think the fundamental principles people are saying this would make society perfect. I think they're actually saying there would be quite a bit of struggle. Like there would be a lot of struggle even after society implemented all of this, right? It just gives you the opportunity to be able to kind of like come to terms with these problems. But like, I don't know, it proves that it isn't just a like communal property relations are not just a legal, relationship, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is something that maybe in like the Angrier Workers and some other pieces, like it isn't necessarily, I think, that might just be like an error as opposed to like an interesting criticism, because this isn't just a new legal relationship. This is like an entirely new way of people relating to production. And that kind of gets into more questions about like, what is a mode of production to you? The Jasper Burns stuff, and I think even like the Angry Workers thing, like I do have a lot of respect for these people having like this totalizing view of what a mode of production is, and understanding that it isn't as simple as you have the new production relations and that's it. But I also don't think that that's really what the Fundamental Principles book is saying. Like, I think that counselists on the whole are very quick to just kind of be like, a mode of production is defined by its social relations, which I think is broadly true. But again, like what I was saying at the beginning of this episode, like you can't just talk about, value theory if you want to talk about capitalism. There's so much more going on. Like obviously the economic base has stayed pretty much exactly the same over the past few centuries in terms of how exploitation works. But the superstructure, to be kind of like broad, like has changed dramatically. And these, the base and the superstructure obviously both influence each other to a pretty extreme degree. So you can't really just talk about one without the other. But at the end of the day, like the councilist kind of idea that, and also like Marx's idea that really these modes of production are defined by their social relationships. And what is described in the Fundamental Principles is a social relationship, not a legal relationship. I do think that that's like broadly correct, but I also think that there is a tendency in those circles to just kind of be a bit flippant about the kind of like, dare I say, dialectical way that a lot of these things like division between town and country, or obviously like, gender relationships, to say nothing of like political structures, like that also influences the development of communism. And so I don't know, I'm kind of just babbling, but I think I'm kind of just trying to say, like, I do think that the fundamental principles are like that kind of way of thinking about the base and the superstructure, and you have to get the base settled before everything else is settled. I do think that that's broadly true. But if we want to talk about communism the same way that we talk about capitalism, you also have to recognize that there's quite a bit more that goes into creating a functioning society than just that. But I do think that kind of like on the other side, like the left kind of like ultra left critique of this stuff falls flat when it tries to say that those equally determine society as the kind of like social relationships that go into making it, because I don't think they do.
Yeah, it does seem like at a slightly crude level. I'm the one being crude here, not the critiques of the fundamental principles, but at a slightly crude level, there's a degree to which one of the retorts to the fundamental principles is to say, well, you haven't thought about XY social cleavage. You haven't accounted for like, we can't just talk about like it's like there's a tendency to say that your politics is made completely illegitimate because you haven't, talked about overcoming the climate crisis, or you haven't talked about how you're going to overcome like, patriarchal gender relations or something, or like, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. As I've been speaking through this, I keep sort of like harking back. I keep going back in my head to the kind of like test of Marxism, test of communism, and just like, just in case people aren't aware, I suppose like we came across this in the Jasper Burns book, and he suggests this sort of like two measures for sort of assessing a set of proposals, I suppose. And he looks at the fundamental principles text and say, well, they do pass the test that Marx sets down for how you overcome capitalism. This is based on a Marxist analysis of value relations and what you have to, how the social relations of capitalism sort of create the broader superstructure of that mode of production. But it doesn't necessarily pass the test of communism, which is like to say, well, there are certain things that we associate with the communist mode of production that like just aren't addressed in this. how do we get to the point where we abolish money, or like but my feeling, I suppose, is does it need to pass the test of communism? Like,
Yeah.
I don't know.
I mean, the thing that's going to have to pass or not pass the test of communism is just the class struggle, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like, to a certain extent, there are a lot of kind of big brain takes where it's like, and here's how I would perfectly plan, like, I don't know, the perfect supply chain, or here's when workers do communism, here's what they should do in terms of like agriculture or something like that, right? It's like, that's all well and good and all that work needs to be done. But like, I do kind of, one thing I really like about the fundamental principles is they just go, look, here's the base thing that you need to do to have the possibility of a communist society and to give people the tools that they need to then create that society. And then they just step back. You know what I mean? Like, even to the extent of like describing how this society would like properly plan its economics, which seems like or its production, a huge part of talking about economics of a society. But like, it's kind of just the class struggle, right? Like, there are different ways that these things can be borne out. Like, there are certain things, obviously, that you wouldn't want to kind of back down on, like moral things. But then at the end of the day, I don't know. It's like workers are going to have to figure it out for themselves how they want to do it. You know what I mean? Like, as long as they tie, individual consumption to social need for a short period of time, hey, man, the group of international communists is like, do what you're going to do. Should we maybe just talk about the Ian Wright thing? I think because this kind of takes us nicely into that. The Ian Wright, I would say, is actually, if you haven't really come across the fundamental principles before, just go read that, because it is as like an introduction. It's a really excellent and like not biased explanation of the processes that the group of international communists say need to happen. Right? They're kind of like economic plans and stuff, and it's very short. And then it just ends with like a critique that I just think is valid. You know what I mean? I'm interested to kind of know what you think, but his criticism is basically just like, this system lacks any kind of principle of adaptation, economic, or I should just say like productive adaptation in terms of like feedback mechanisms for how much needs to be produced, how firms are going to get what they need. They're not like, that just isn't covered at all in the fundamental principles. And so he just basically says, because that's such a vital element of any society, he's like, say what you will about the fundamental principles. And he actually doesn't really say that much. He's kind of just like, yeah, sure. Yeah, great. This could work. No big deal, whatever. But he's kind of like, because it doesn't talk about any kind of planning, any kind of reactive mechanisms for, adapting to market signals like what capitalism does. He calls it, he uses that phrase, it's a clock without a spring. Which is funny because I was like, I feel like it's a spring without a clock. It's like, is there a distinction to be made here? But I mean, he's just broadly correct, right? Like, I think he's coming at this from an analysis of capitalism, as you should. And he's seen what capitalism does that we would want to keep. And he's seen what capitalism does that we would certainly not want to keep. And he's just saying the fundamental principles just doesn't. And again, this might seem like semantics, and maybe it is. But because of that, because none of those things exist, he's just saying, you can't call this the fundamental principles of communist production and distribution, which, like, okay, call it something else, but point taken. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess it's worth saying, like, to start, that he doesn't take the tact of the agri workers, right? In that he accepts this is a broad sketch outline. You're providing some economic laws, an effort to sort of present an economic driving force without endeavoring to fill in all of the blanks, all of the political process. So he sort of just like he sort of like accepts, okay, this is an effort of some fundamental principles. Fair play, yeah. And there are certain aspects of which he seems to agree broadly with the thrust of it. He makes, like I was saying before we started, like I couldn't work out whether these were like withering critiques or completely mundane. Like maybe I just didn't understand what he was attempting to say, I suppose. I mean, one of the things he does talk about is he makes an effort to criticize the fundamental principles, believing that they have overcome wage labor by creating a direct relationship between how much people work and what they're able to draw out of the collective social product. Like the fundamental principles are saying, at base, what we're offering is a sort of system or a mechanism whereby people, they have the right of disposal over the product because they're allowed to consume in direct relation to how much they've put in. And what Wright's focusing on is their critique of the Soviet Union, and he's sort of like describing the fundamental principles critique of the Soviet Union, which I outlined before, which is to say, well, the Soviet Union has maintained wage labor because they're determining through some state-centered political process what the wage is going to be. So there is maintaining the separation. He attempts to make an analogy between that process, the Soviet Union saying what the wage is going to be, and therefore breaking this connection between what the workers contribute versus what they're able to withdraw. He says he seems to be implying that that's basically the same as the fundamental principles or the group of international communists saying that workers aren't going to be paid in 100% of what they contribute, because there's going to have to be some kind of deduction for what is a sort of like social tax, or a certain amount that's going to be skimmed off the top to pay for the things that are going to be provided for people for free, or to cover like the subsistence needs of people who aren't able to work, or to contribute to some general fund that covers sort of disaster planning and crisis and that kind of thing. So he almost seems to be implying that like one is as good as the other. Was that the impression you got? Basically, the impression that I got throughout this entire piece was sort of to say, well, because you, the fundamental, the group of international communist proposal, because what you're proposing is so similar to capitalism, because like wages as they operate under your system are so similar to how wages were operated under the Soviet sort of central planning system, or how your mechanisms mirror so thoroughly the sort of price mechanisms of the market. I got the impression he was saying one is as good as the other. Like, why not? You could equally well have communism and still have wages, or you could equally still have a centrally planned economy and still have markets or market forces. Maybe I'm sort of like misunderstanding.
I mean, I think to a certain extent, like we've spoken about this before, I'd kind of a little bit, maybe I just misunderstand why you can't just call the fundamental principles thing like a market. It kind of just is a market. You know what I mean? So it's like, I know that it's not like capital M, capital S market socialism, right? But like, I
sort of thought this guy was going down a market socialist route, you know, just sort of saying,
maybe.
well, like,
I mean, maybe it's just a route where it's like, you know, you could do what the Soviet Union did and make it work, which like maybe that's just an idea of like, you could make enough calculations and have it function, right? And it's like, well, yeah, but would you want that? You know what I mean? Like, would you want, like, again, you want those calculations that market socialism does to find like these perfect prices. Like, you kind of just want that to be an emergent part of the production system as a whole, right? Like, you don't really want, I guess the fundamental principles like argument against that would be like, that is just another form of alienating labor, where it's like an alien body is deciding, you know, what your labor is worth, or what a product is worth. Like, I don't know if I necessarily got the view that he was like defending that kind of market socialism or anything, but maybe he was just kind of saying like a similar thing could be done if you calculated things enough. Maybe. I'm not sure. I don't know.
Yeah, he does say, like, there's a criticism that I feel like we've come across before, and that I've never really thoroughly worked through whether I agree with it or not. And I think he's coming from this tract of to say it's not sufficient to choose one metric for your planning. He definitely seems to be in the sort of like, you're going to have to pick other ways of measuring whether something is like socially beneficial or socially negative, or like he doesn't necessarily outline what those are going to be. I mean, I suppose that like there is no this. In some ways, this comes back to the prior distinction. You know, you can start with labor time planning, and then when you're in the sort of political process of working out how you're going to plan the economy, then you can bring all sorts of information into the equation, I suppose.
Yeah, and again, that's a decision that people will make when they're there. You know what I mean? That's one of those. I mean, I don't know. I'm of two minds about that, because it's like, on one hand, like, I get it. You wouldn't want people to just only be thinking about the labor that goes into a product, especially right now with like the climate crisis. But I also don't think you want to. I don't know. I don't think it's a good idea to really, if you're going to do the fundamental principles thing, like, I don't think you'd want to import any more information into the price that's qualitatively different from just like labor time. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think you'd want anything else in the price, because then it just stops being meaningful. Or not that it stops being meaningful, it stops being a labor time price, which is obvious. And I think, he would agree with that. But I think what I'm kind of trying to say is that feels like it kind of breaks the point of tying individual work with total social output, because then you just go back to the market and you're like, oh, I guess there's a rent on top of this, because like there's not a good rubber harvest, I guess, that, like, what? I don't really, maybe there was just a bad harvest here. But then on the other hand, it's like, you're going to need to figure out a way to have adaptive mechanisms, exactly like what Wright's talking about here, so that you don't just destroy the planet, if that's something that would happen if you tied labor to this social output. But I don't know. I think maybe it's just my interpretation that's like, on one hand, I'm just kind of like, whatever, like, workers will figure that out. What if they want to do that, then they're going to do that. If they don't want to do that, then they're not going to do it. You know what I mean? But I'm also just like that. I think that needs to be a planning thing, and not a like, it almost feels a bit technocratic, you know what I mean? To be like, well, what's the social good of this, and how can we perfectly import that into the price? It's like, who's defining what a social good is, and also like, what does that have to do with what is supposed to just be like, how hard is it to make this thing? I don't know. It feels a bit weird. But again, like, it's totally right to be like, well, okay, then how are you going to do it? Because you do need to do it somehow. I just think it needs to be done. I don't know. Get some guy to figure it out. You know what I mean? You know what I mean? Some guy with a good brain.
Every time I come across like people talking about different metrics for analyzing the sort of like social benefit or worth of things, I'm always reminded of kind of like Blairite era, like happiness accounting kind of thing, like trying to work out metrics for working out how happy everybody is. And like,
that's just astrology. You know what I'm saying? What was it? What was the movie we watched? Was it Hypernormalization, where there is that shot of Blair like pretending to play an electric guitar? That's like seared into my memory whenever we talk about him. Like, what's the happiness metric of him noodling on a pretend Stratocaster?
No, I don't remember that. What a horrible image. Nasty.
Yeah. All right. Well, yeah. I mean, I think of all of these, I did really like Wright's a lot, just because it does kind of raise this question of like, how fundamental are we talking here? Like, when we're actually talking about trying to consciously, because yes, obviously the main part of communist society is getting rid of exploitation and having directly social labor, and getting rid of class, obviously, but also the big part of it, and you can also just kind of define communism like this to a certain extent, is like everybody consciously making society together. And that would also seem like a pretty fundamental part of communist production and distribution. And so how you think about doing that, that's something to also just consider. But I also, I don't know. What I was gonna say is, I don't know how many councilists would just ignore that. But the fundamental principles, they're just like, it's councils. It's like,
Well, I can only recapitulate what we have said already, which is like, I'm of the opinion that the fundamental principles provides the mechanism whereby you're able to like have go through a political process which socializes production and allows for the collective social control of this economic process, I guess, overcomes that separation between like overcomes private production and makes production fully social, and therefore allows for that to be a sort of conscious social process.
It gets past like, at least class in the purely like economic, like capitalist sense, right? Where it's like, it makes it so that no longer can somebody just own the means of production, because they're all owned by everybody. One last thing to say, it was pretty funny. I do love how Hermann, in responding to the critiques that there's nothing really in here about the political, was just like, yeah, just read workers' councils and come back to me. It's like, but it's an interesting point. We haven't read workers' councils, or I haven't. I don't know if you have, but like, there's an interesting kind of idea there where it's like the assumption by the authors of the fundamental principles is that people are already on board with workers' councils. You know what I mean? And that it's already just assumed that that's going to be the vehicle for communism. And, maybe looking back on this like 100 years later, like maybe not necessarily in the sense that they thought it was going to be, but to a certain extent, like obviously if you're trying to like make it so that each firm is able to have autonomy, democratic autonomy, but still like not reliant on, but like they necessarily have to kind of carry out society's democratically agreed upon plan. Like, yeah, that's just going to look like a council. You know what I mean? That's just going to look like workers in their workplace deciding these things in a manner that just is a council. So like, whether or not you can just answer the criticisms of the fundamental principles by literally just being like, read Pannekoek or not, it's an interesting point. And then the reverse of that, Hermann also says, is that, Pannekoek also is this true? Pannekoek just assumed that labor time accounting would be the economic way of organizing society. And so he was just writing about the politics. I don't know if that's true, but it sounds right. So,
maybe we'll find out one day.
Maybe we'll find out one day.
I did quite like the angry workers quip that like councilists in the kind of like group of International Communist Day were all astronomers, and now they're all computer programmers. They made the assertion that those groups of people are interested in closed systems, and they're attempting to create a closed system. I don't think they're interested in closed systems, or they're attempting to create a closed system. Well, maybe they're referencing the sort of connection that's often made by people between the program for communism of the group of international communists and the sort of like social technology of cybernetics, I guess. But it doesn't seem like those are closed systems. I feel like what's being presented is like I forgot. I'd like to find the sort of correct cybernetic word for sort of like layers of
recursion.
Recursion, yeah, exactly.
There's something like that.
Yeah.
There's a word. Yeah, I mean,
not closed systems; they're recursive systems. Come on.
Yeah, exactly. And that is basically what they say about councils, right? Is they're like, it's a cascading system of councils. Each council, builds up, and you want to have that same kind of like structure in a way that is pretty cybernetic, right? Where it's like you want to have the same structure, but just in like, I don't know, responding to different things, right?
I find quite interesting one of their critiques, and I don't know whether this is not to say that it's necessarily legitimate or it's like, but that one of the critiques they make is that the fundamental principles don't suggest an ideal size for an economic unit, which to some extent seems reasonable if you're going to imagine a workplace of like 1,000 workers versus a workplace of 10 workers, and the only information you have for what's going on in there is the number of hours consumed, number of hours of labor added to a product before you sort of pass it down the production chain. They make what seems like a very fair point that like those are not an analogous piece of information. One gives you so much more information about what's happening in a space than another. But I guess it kind of overlooks the potential recursiveness. Now you can go internal to a workplace. You can also, somebody in like a council internal to a workplace can look at every individual person's hour consumption use of hours or whatever. Exactly. Or maybe we would choose not to do that, but like every plant, every shop floor, every supermarket department, every I mean,
again, this is just something that capitalism does. It just does it to exploit people, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, again, like maybe that's the last thing we can touch on is I think like there are a lot of criticisms of the fundamental principles that are, and we came across this a lot in the Jasper Burns, where it's like, does this not create the structure for like social pressure to recreate a kind of like really nasty way of like, maybe like tyranny of the majority kind of thing, where it's like, why is this one firm not fucking doing what it's supposed to with the social plan? Let's just go and, kick their asses. Like, obviously that's not like the main critique, but it's like this idea that you're setting up a society where there could potentially be a like, secret police in charge of enforcing the general social will. And like to that, I would just say, like, again, that's going to need to be how workers sort it out. I mean, more so just like, I think they're just describing politics. Like I think when people talk about the general social will of society, or the plan, maybe I should say, the like general plan, there's a big kind of like, oh, well, and this is what everybody would agree upon because we have a classless society. And of course it is. And it's like, well, no, like there's still going to be like politics and people are still going to disagree. And if anything, this like brings politics to the forefront. It like allows people to actually be able to have a political voice, and not just a political voice, but like have an economic voice where they say, I don't think we should be doing things like that. But what society wouldn't have that? You know what I mean? Like other than the Borg, which not saying we shouldn't do that, but till somebody figures out how.
I mean, I guess the hoped for response to that from society and by the group of international communists is to say that mechanism wouldn't be used as a sort of disciplining hand, but as a opportunity to help,
yeah, but I mean, it's again, but it's very much in people's best interest to help and not to like just hassle people, because again, it's like one firm producing better, one country, wouldn't be like a country, but like one geographic area producing better is in everybody's interest. It's not like now where it's like, you want people to do worse because you're competing with them.
I mean, the only thing that I wonder is whether in this period of like social, political, economic transition between capitalism and whatever comes next, I do wonder whether there won't be a sort of like historic tendency or pressure or preference to recapitulate the social relations of capitalism or how capitalism functions rather than to advance towards something else. In that situation where there's like there are two possibilities and one feels more familiar, more, I don't know, like one is more analogous or more comfortable to a capitalist way of organizing things. I do sort of wonder whether it will take quite a lot of counter pressure to not have that capitalist mechanism be the one that is defaulted to, I suppose. Is that
like markets, you mean? Or like,
yeah, or even just like, I don't know,
force?
No, I'm sort of implying, I suppose implying that using metric like labor time accounting to analyze the productivity of a workplace and choosing to discipline that workplace rather than, find a way of further incorporating it into like social production kind of thing. Like the decision, the desire to discipline might be just defaulted to.
I think that's totally fair. I think that's absolutely fair. The only thing I would say is that like once you get past commodity fetishism, you have directly social labor, you tie people's individual interests to what's best for society in an economic sense. Mm-hmm. I think the first distinct instinct would not be to discipline, but I think maybe I'm also just kind of like imagining maybe a bit later of a communist society. Again, how communist is your populace? That's like something you said that I think about a lot, where it's like, that's what a lot of these debates are. How communist is your populace? Because maybe at the beginning it would just be to punish people, right? And you could see that sorting itself out pretty badly when you're trying to develop, certain parts of the world that have been intentionally underdeveloped by capitalist social relations. So yeah, fair enough, I think.
I mean, I suppose the angry worker critique, the concern of the angry workers, the people writing that text, would be that I guess we need to find other mechanisms to ensure the sort of like the communist tendency wins out, I suppose, in that situation.
I think there's always going to be a tyranny of the majority thing. You know what I mean? And it's just about allowing people to kind of like freely develop. Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. That's always like, yeah, we're creating a democratic society. You know what I mean? Like you're going to have to figure out ways to kind of meet everybody's desires and needs and opinions. First past the post. That'll sort it out.
Okay.
Not everything. You know what I mean?
I was hoping I was just going to get to sit around and play video games all day under communism.
Well, you certainly won't be podcasting, Dan. I'll say that.
Banned.
Yeah, exactly. All microphones melted down into their component parts.
Yeah. Well, great.
All right.
Well, until then.
Until then.
We'll see you next week.
See you next week. Very glad we got to get to all this stuff and explicitly talk about the fundamental principles back on our council is bullshit. Yeah. Let us know what you think, people. See you next week. Hey, everybody. Jack here. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. The song that you heard on this episode is Music to Kill Bad People To by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. You can go ahead and check this song out much more on their Bandcamp at kinggizzard.bandcamp.com. If you want to go ahead and get in touch with us, chat shit, tell us that we're wrong, whatever you want to do, you can go ahead and do that at auxiliarystatements@gmail.com. You can just send us a message there. Or you can get in touch with us on Twitter, on Discord, on Instagram. You're a smart person. You can find these places. We got a YouTube. We post stuff there as well. Sometimes we stream. Thank you so much for listening. Till next time.